Welcome everyone, and thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us for our webinar covering the NFPA 70B updates and how to stay compliant. Through the webinar today, if you have any questions, we have a question pane that's built into the GoToWebinar console that can be accessed from the right-hand side of your screen. We'll answer some of those questions throughout the webinar, and we'll have a good amount of time set aside after the webinar to continue answering those questions live on the air. Now, today we'll be joined by John Gould from our BD Department, Business Development, and John Wagner from our ITC training team. They'll be heading up the webinar here, and I'll go ahead and pass it over to John Gould right now to get us started. John, over to you.
Thanks very much, Chris. Good to have everyone with us today to go through this very important topic. Before we get started, I also wanted to introduce John Wagner from our ITC team. John, can you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Thank you, John. Again, as it was said, my name's John Wagner. I'm an instructor with the Infrared Training Center, the training arm of Teledyne FLIR. I've spent over 30 years in the electrical testing field using infrared thermography amongst other testing, including multiple different types of meters. I've also been involved in training in NFPA 70B, which is our topic today, but also safety training NFPA 70E.
Great. Well, thanks so much, John, for that introduction, and look forward to having you as part of our Q&A at the end today. Bring a lot of valuable insight into the topic for today. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. So our agenda for today is listed out here, but really wanted to just make sure everyone understands really what the purpose of this standard is. So it's really providing that practical safeguarding for persons, property, and processes, really understanding and establishing that condition of maintenance for your electrical equipment and systems for safety and reliability. So that's really the purpose statement for NFPA 70B. What we're going to be talking about today is what's new within this new regulation requirements and how it's going to affect your organization. Really where some value and benefits of adopting these standards will be for your organization, how we at Teledyne FLIR can help. And lastly, we'll finish off with some question and answers, and we'll look to address any particular points of concern you may have, and hopefully get you started on your journey or assist in developing it further. Okay, so what's new? Really wanted to focus for key takeaways is that these new standards do affect processes, procedures, and documentation. It's really important to note that. Chief among them is the language has now changed with thermography moving from recommended and required. And what we've done is we've gone through the documentation and tried to highlight the key facts or key points that we want to bring to our various customers who are using our tools, as well as those who may be new to them, to really understand what's important and what to gather from this standard. So we've broken it into three sections. The first being the procedural side, so understanding that shift from recommended to required with thermography, a little bit about condition-based requirements, and then also procedures with your asset classes that are under your electrical maintenance program. From there, we're going to go into the people side of what's affected, understanding this coordinator role, as well as some qualifications around the personnel and your thermographers that are out there doing these infrared scans. And lastly, we're going to hit quickly on documentation, talk a little bit about delta T or temperature differences, what's really required for test records, and lastly, your calibration requirements for your tools. So I'm going to move right on into the procedural side. So these key procedural changes, they're going to impact your processes around your maintenance programs for electrical, the language being changed from recommended to required. I put on the right-hand side here all of the actual section references, so you guys can pull those up if you need to reference what we're talking about today, but really wanted to highlight this move from recommended to required and why that's important. The maintenance activity tasks, if you look at the types and assets and equipment that you're inspecting, the minimum requirement is every 12 months. 6 months is a requirement for any category 3 type equipment, and we can talk about that a bit more. Condition-based assessments need to be performed and tracked over time. So you need to identify all of the physical conditions of your electrical equipment, what their current condition is and being able to track that over time, because those conditions are directly correlated to the type of maintenance activities, the frequency of activity, and those are going to be important to highlight in your electrical maintenance program. Additionally, detailed test procedures for all equipment requiring maintenance. Many folks will leverage the manufacturer recommendations for their equipment, and we suggest that you do that. But it also does provide guidance around specific activities and intervals that need to be performed for your maintenance for your electrical equipment. These are indicated as shall be performed, and noting that they're at not greater intervals than specified within the tables within the standards. Really important to note here is that if you don't have anything to pull from or anything to build from, the NFPA guidance has really provided a great resource to identify not only the tasks but frequencies of maintenance. So what does this mean for your personnel and for your teams that are involved with these maintenance activities? The first being an electrical maintenance program coordinator is now going to be a requirement. And this person shall identify all of the various assets that are required to be maintained, and also responsible for that evaluation process of those conditions. So this is really a critical role in the organization. It needs to be clearly identified and in support of your electrical maintenance program. Personnel shall be qualified to perform those test procedures on the specific equipment to be tested. So this is beyond the scope of thermal for all of your specific maintenance tasks. Any of the methodologies that you're using or are prescribed to be performed, they need to be qualified to do so. And it's very important that they understand what those roles are within those maintenance tasks, and your teams are qualified to do so. And lastly, within this section, the qualification to operate the test equipment that is used. So understanding that folks are qualified to operate the test equipment and the type of test to perform. And this is really where we're going to talk to within the cameras themselves and the thermography activities that are associated with these electrical inspections. Your team is properly certified and qualified to perform those tasks. Within documentation, we have an area called Delta T. So Delta T requirements, really that is all about the comparison between electrical components and ambient air temperatures. So if you're performing your electrical inspections and the thermal tasks that you need to make sure that you're not only capturing the thermal images of your electrical assets, but also performing Delta T calculations. It's very important to note here, as well as you're doing those activities, that those test records are including as found and as left results. So as a part of your procedures, if you're performing certain activities, you need to document, among many other things, the indication of as found and as left test results. This is where thermography is really going to be important to understand that whatever maintenance or repair activity that was done in support of that inspection, we can clearly document that as found and as left. And lastly, this is with documentation relative to your test equipment. The test equipment should be calibrated and it should be traceable to recognized national standards. NIST is a very common standard, and with all of our cameras, we do have a calibration process and service that we offer that does meet this standard, but it's important to note that this needs to be documented and maintained as you go through your program, and really want to make sure you're focused on your test equipment in all cases is properly calibrated wherever measurements are required. So let's talk a little bit about value and benefits for adopting NFPA 70B. As much as it's important to follow and comply with standards, there's really some great commitment to safety and a state of good repair with this particular guidance. Moving on with a focus on safety, it's core to your electrical programs, not only for your people, but also the equipment that you're looking to maintain. Provides that programmatic approach to maintaining your electrical equipment with standards that are easily defined and applied. If you can go through the guidance and can very quickly identify the activities that need to be performed, the maintenance intervals, and the types of things that need to be done in support of that, and really provides ultimately asset reliability improvements. If you're performing the correct maintenance activities at the appropriate intervals, leveraging thermography as an early identifier of potential failure, the reliability of your electrical assets will improve. And lastly, maintaining compliance with your key regulatory agencies. As much as this guidance is important for all, each individual regulatory body that oversees your particular area has very much leaned to NFPA standards as requirements, but also, and want to really highlight this, insurance policy requirements as well. Many organizations will be focusing with their insurance companies as they enter this phase of review to understand from the policy underwriting perspective, what types of maintenance requirements do you need to undertake and to comply with to ensure that you're meeting your policy requirements. So I'd encourage folks to go out and speak with your insurance providers to understand what does NFPA 70B mean for you. As we're hearing from our insurance companies and working with them, it's very important. It's becoming very much a part of folks' policies moving forward. So how can we help, right? At the end of the day, we as an organization provide the cameras, software, training, and services to ensure that you and your teams are compliant with these updated requirements. We provide leading cameras in the area of thermography and want to make sure you're equipping your team with the right tools. Right? One key factor with our cameras in the Delta T functionality, being able to, within your camera, perform the Delta T calculations right on camera. It's a real important fact and part of your inspection process that you want to consider. Within software, we offer the software that allows you to properly document those inspections, your as is and your as left conditions. Additionally, with routing capability, you can predefine and establish lists of all of those electrical components that do require inspection, and very quickly go out and perform those inspection activities with our software and camera together. Training, our team is focused heavily on providing the appropriate level of certification for you and your thermographers. So our level 1 and level 2 electrical training is part of the requirement relative to your staff being trained that are performing these inspections. We want to make sure that folks have the proper training. A really important point to note here is that there is no one-time training for this. They do require updates annually and continuing education in this area. So you want to make sure you partner with an organization that offers training that is going to be compliant with that standard. And lastly, services. So being able to offer those calibration services that you and your team will need for your cameras as you move forward, as well as any other service needs and repairs that you may have. So with that, we'll move on to our Q&A portion of our webinar here today. I put a QR code on the screen here. You can scan this at your leisure. And what we've really done here at FLIR is we wanted to make sure that you had a single place where folks could go for information on this topic, as well as some offerings that we have where we've bundled together our solutions. So between the training, the cameras themselves, the service, and software, be able to provide you with what you need to get started and get compliant with your NFPA 70B efforts. So with that, I have a few questions that we're going to have start coming in here, and wanted to bring John back on here to go ahead and start answering some for us. So John, are you here with us now?
Yes, I am, John.
Okay, great. So John, in the webinar, we talked about the need to document temperature differences and load readings. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit more on what's required with that?
Yes. NFPA 70B recognizes that the best way for analysis of problems is to compare the temperature of an electrical component to either a similar component under the similar load or compare it to the ambient air temperature. In both cases, there are in the tables of 70B, but also in other documents recognized in the industry, there are thresholds of temperature that define how serious a difference in temperature is and what action to take. And this is the first time that NFPA has taken this stance where they're requiring the measurement of temperatures and the comparing of a component temperature to something similar or to the ambient air temperature. And so it's very significant. One other thing that NFPA has also recognized is that load is critical. That brings up really two things. Number one, to check load, you have to have electrical equipment, say a current clamp, to measure the load of the electrical equipment. NFPA 70B says that there's a need of at least 40% of electrical current on the component to validate the temperature measurements. We all know that current drives temperature. So as we make this comparison component to component or component to air temperature, it's critical that it be compared when we have a sufficient amount of load. So that's important also.
Yeah, those are great points, John. So taking those measurements and understanding the need to perform those temperature differences, NFPA 70B talks a bit about line of sight for those temperature measurements. Can you maybe expand a little bit more on what that means and in terms of taking proper images?
Yeah, John, it's simply this. Covers have to be removed, whether it be a bolted cover, whether it be a hinge door, whether it be a piece of Lexan or plexiglass that is inside the cover or door. Infrared needs direct line of sight for temperature measurement and developing those difference in temperatures. Now, because of safety, electrical shock, and particularly electrical arc flash hazards, sometimes opening a piece of equipment, if the arc flash hazard is high enough, can be prohibited or considered to be a bit too dangerous or unsafe. And so in the case of not being able to open up a component, using an infrared window made out of something like calcium fluoride or polycarbonate material allows us the line of sight. We are able to do both qualitative thermography. This is where we just want to look at differences thermally in the image, or we're even able to do quantitative thermography, measuring temperatures accurately and making those comparisons. Both the cameras, whether, if we look at our different line of cameras at Teledyne FLIR, we have the ability to correct for looking through infrared windows. We also have this ability in our Thermal Studio software.
Yeah, those are all really great points, and in understanding that folks need to understand and learn a bit more about that. I know we talked a little bit about training requirements for staff during the webinar today. Can you talk a bit more about what FLIR offers through ITC to address these requirements and maybe get your staff properly trained on this component?
That's a great question, John. At the Infrared Training Center, or the ITC, we really focus on two lines of training. One is equipment that we train on, the infrared cameras and the meters, like a multimeter, like a current probe, where we want the students, whether it be a level 1 or a level 2 certification course, we want them to become more and more familiar at understanding how the camera operates. How do you calculate a delta T? Where does the data go for the current probe or for the multimeter doing contact resistance? So training on the equipment itself. And then the second road that we want to explore and expand in level 1 and level 2 electrical training is, how do we understand the science? How do we understand the measurement of temperatures? We many times will tell our students, we're trying to debunk the idea of point, shoot, and measure. The cameras are able to measure temperature very accurately, but there are concepts and functions on the camera that have to be followed so that we can guarantee ourselves that we're measuring not only the temperatures correctly, but also the difference in temperatures.
Yeah, those are great. So John, we have a few more questions that are coming in from our Q&A chat here today, and we'll get through those here, just going through them real quick. All right, so got some great questions coming in. I encourage you to use that questions box, ask those additional questions. We'll get through as many as we can here. So first question, and I could take this one, John. It's do you need Thermal Studio Standard or Thermal Studio Pro to do Delta T in the software? So Delta T is available in all of our versions of FLIR Thermal Studio, as well as our Ignite cloud platform as well. So the creating of Delta T measurements within software is available there. But there's some really great questions here, John, for you that I'd like to get through. This question is, what's the minimum requirement of a qualified person to perform infrared? And a follow-up to that is, would that be level 1? And how often does that need to be updated?
Level 1, training is the place to begin. We have 3 levels of certification, level 1, level 2, level 3. They build upon each other. A level 1 course is 4 days in length. We spend our time looking at the basics of both camera operation and the infrared science. And then once you earn that, there is practical work to be completed and also examination work at the end of the week. And once that's all completed, you earn a level 1 certification that's valid for 4 years and is you're able to renew or update that certification every 4 years by several different methods.
Great. Kind of following up with that relative to the actual testing of those things, how long should equipment be energized before taking infrared measurements? I think one of the things we can talk about is load requirements for testing. That may be a good way to come at this one. So if you want to go ahead and answer that, John.
Well, as you stated during the webinar, John, load is important. There is a lot of questions about, can we de-energize equipment, open it up, and then re-energize equipment to heat it up? And that's something that some people practice. It can be difficult because depending on the size of the equipment, depending on how much load is upon it, once we remove load, reheating it could take just minutes, or it could take longer. It could take 30 to 60 minutes to get it to a point where we can analyze it. It's really better to, with proper safety equipment and safety training, if it's allowed to be open while energized, then do so, or to install infrared windows.
Yeah, those are great options available. So one of the questions here, are there categories of equipment that are included in this regulation? Is that list available?
Yes, if you go to NFPA 70B, particularly the new edition, they break down equipment by component. For instance, switch gear and switchboards, UPSs, distribution panels, liquid-filled transformers, dry transformers, branch circuit breaker panels, UPS equipment. They now have a new category in this new edition on solar panels. And so they literally go chapter by chapter after laying out the requirements of a recommended maintenance program. They apply those fundamentals that they mentioned in the early chapters are applied to these particular pieces of equipment chapter by chapter. One of the things I just want to mention, John, that is new in 70B recently released is that infrared has penetrated these chapters like never before. And so in each of these sections, they talk about what needs to be infrareded on these pieces of equipment.
Yeah, and having reviewed that documentation, and there's definitely very specific guidance there. And as you mentioned, infrared is listed throughout. If you look at the frequency schedules for maintenance activities, it's broken down very specifically by asset class, so the different types of electrical equipment. But the very first line on that table of frequency is thermal inspections for all equipment, and at a minimum of 12 months. There are categorizations of equipment, so your electrical coordinator will need to categorize as well as condition each of those pieces of equipment, and that will have to be maintained and documented over time as your maintenance requirements change based on condition and criticality. So the guidance is very explicit there, and it'll really help you from a programmatic perspective build that out. So those are all great components. There's a question about is there a fine if a company does not comply with the requirements. So just kind of wanted to talk to that a little bit. So as it has become now a standard, and I think that's an important component to this. 70B used to be guidance as a total document. Now it is becoming a standard, and as such, the key bodies that typically deal with electrical safety related components within NEC, as well as OSHA, they're working to adopt those standards within their guidance and their specific regulatory components. So as NFPA 70B just came out at the beginning of this year, those organizations are working to incorporate those components. So I would defer to your local governing jurisdictions regarding compliance with those standards. And as we mentioned in the webinar, the need to maintain and understand what your insurance obligations are with any of your underwritten components with maintaining your equipment to a state of good repair, and how adopting these standards may become now part of that. So important to deal with there. So in terms of some other questions that we may have here, how does arc flash face shield affect the color palette for the thermographer? John, I don't know if you can speak to that a little bit.
That's a tough one. It's hard. It would be better probably to use less contrast as opposed to more contrast, meaning if you're working with an arc flash face shield over your eyes, a gray palette or an iron palette, in my opinion, and again, that's an opinion. Some people might be able to work better with a face shield in something like rainbow high contrast. But I always found that it was easier either in gray or iron to be able to see the screen and see either bright or dark better with less color as opposed to more color.
Yeah, that's a great response. And I think those are the types of things that you would be covering in the infrared training around that equipment specific maintenance and kind of working through what's best practice in those areas. So that's a great question. I just want to leave with this. So we have a little bit of time left. If all the questions that remain unanswered, we're going to certainly work to get some responses back to you. Some of the questions about the recording, we'll make that available to all those who registered for this event. But really, the question that I kind of have where most folks are, where do I get started when it comes to compliance with NFPA 70B, John?
Well, programs like this, or becoming compliant with a standard like this, begins with equipment training. It begins also with identifying what components you have that need to be maintained electrically. And so those are the three things that, what kind of test equipment do we need to get started? Infrared camera, multimeter, the ability to measure current. There might be some other equipment that those would be some of the basics that you would need. Training on how to use your various test equipment. Multimeters are not super difficult, but we want to make sure that we understand how our equipment operates and understand the data that it reports. There is both live and online infrared training that the ITC provides, the Infrared Training Center. And then finally, it begins by building, we have the procedures and the recommended test methods in NFPA 70B. Once we begin a list, it's beginning to build a schedule. And then the most important thing is how do you gather, keep, and record all that data? I know I'm making a plug here, but our Thermal Studio plus our Route Creator software permits us to not only keep a list of the equipment and what needs to be checked, but also gives us the ability to create a place of storage for the data that we collect, images and other data with our other meters. And now it becomes historical.
Yeah. Well, those are great. Well, we're at time for today. I do want to thank everyone for joining us. As I mentioned, we'll provide this recording to folks who've registered for this event, as well as follow up on any questions that we may have. If you do have the opportunity to go to our website and learn more about NFPA and future events such as this, we look forward to speaking with you again in the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Thanks, John, for the excellent presentation. Everybody who joined, thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us for the webinar. Again, any of the questions that are still looming in the questions pane, we'll take the time to follow up with those later on. So appreciate your attendance today and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.